The gunshot echoed across the vast Wyoming plains as Nora Parker stumbled forward, clutching her bleeding arm. The year was 1885, and she'd just escaped the clutches of the notorious Blackwell gang, who had ambushed the stagecoach she'd been traveling on. Everyone else was dead: the driver, the guard, and the elderly couple who'd shared her journey from St. Louis. Only Nora had managed to slip away in the chaos, but not before taking a bullet. Night was falling fast, bringing with it a bitter autumn chill that cut through her torn dress. The blood loss made her dizzy, her vision blurring as she trudged through the tall grass. In the distance, she spotted a flicker of orange light: a campfire. Hope surged through her veins, giving her the strength for a few more steps before her legs gave out entirely. "Help," she called, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "Please help." The world tilted sideways as she collapsed, consciousness slipping away like water through her fingers. The last thing she remembered was the thundering of hooves and a man's voice, rough but gentle, calling out to her. Miss, can you hear me?" When Nora next opened her eyes, she was lying beside a crackling fire, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket. The pain in her arm had dulled to a persistent throb, and she realized someone had bandaged her wound. She tried to sit up but found herself too weak to manage it. "Easy there," came a deep voice from across the fire. "You've lost a fair bit of blood." A man moved into her field of vision, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. He wore a battered cowboy hat and a faded denim shirt with a star-shaped badge pinned to his leather vest. "My name's Reid Jackson," he said, kneeling beside her. "I'm the sheriff from Willow Creek, about 20 miles east of here." He offered her a tin cup filled with something steaming. "Think you can manage some broth? You need your strength." "Nora," she managed, her throat dry and painful. "Nora Parker." Sheriff Jackson carefully supported her head as he brought the cup to her lips. The broth was hot and savory, warming her from the inside out. "The Blackwell gang," she whispered after a few sips. "They attacked the stagecoach. Everyone else is—" her voice broke. "I know," he said grimly. "I've been tracking them for 2 days. Found the wreckage about an hour before I found you." A coughing fit overtook her, and she felt a fever beginning to take hold. Sheriff Jackson's brow furrowed with concern as he touched her forehead. "You're burning up, Miss Parker," he said, reaching for his canteen. He dampened a handkerchief and placed it gently on her forehead. "I need to get you to a doctor, but you're in no condition to travel tonight." Nora's teeth began to chatter as chills racked her body. The sheriff added more wood to the fire and moved closer to her side. "I know you don't know me from Adam," he said softly, tucking the blanket more securely around her. "But I give you my word, I won't leave your side until you're safe." As the fever took hold, Nora drifted in and out of consciousness. Through the haze, she was aware of Sheriff Jackson tending the fire, periodically checking her bandages and coaxing her to drink more broth. Whenever the nightmares came, visions of the stagecoach attack, of blood and screams, his deep voice would anchor her back to reality. "I'm right here, Miss Parker," he would whisper. "You're not alone." Dawn broke with Nora still in the grip of fever. Reid Jackson knew he needed to get her to a doctor quickly. Her wound wasn't life-threatening, but infection was setting in, and she needed proper care. He saddled his horse, a sturdy Palomino named Buck, and carefully lifted Nora onto the saddle before mounting behind her. He cradled her against his chest, keeping her as steady as possible as they began the journey to Willow Creek. "Hold on, Miss Parker," he murmured as she trembled against him. "Just hold on." The ride was slow and careful, with Reid stopping often to give Nora water and check her condition. By midday, they reached the outskirts of Willow Creek, a small but growing cattle town nestled in a valley. Doc Miller's office was at the end of the main street. The elderly physician rushed out when Reid called, helping him carry Nora inside. "Bullet wound to the upper arm," Reid explained as they laid her on the examination table. "Fever set in last night." "How long ago was she shot?" Doc Miller asked, already cutting away the makeshift bandage. "About 24 hours, I reckon. She was attacked by the Blackwell gang." The doctor's hands stilled for a moment. Poor girl. Well, let's get her fixed up. Reid paced outside while Doc Miller worked, his hat in his hands. He'd been chasing the Blackwell gang for months, ever since they'd robbed the bank in Willow Creek and killed his deputy. But now, finding Nora Parker wounded and alone on the plains had shifted something in him. His need for justice remained, but it was now coupled with an unexpected protective instinct toward this woman he barely knew. After what seemed like hours, Doc Miller emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "She'll live," he announced. "The bullet went clean through, which is a blessing. I've cleaned the wound thoroughly and given her quinine for the fever. What she needs now is rest and care." "Can she stay here?" Reid asked. Doc Miller shook his head. "I've got 3 patients with influenza coming in tomorrow. It's not safe for her here with that open wound." Reid frowned, considering his options. "I'll take her to my place then. I've got a spare room." The doctor raised an eyebrow. "That might cause talk, Sheriff." "I don't give a damn about talk, Doc. She's got no one else and I promised I wouldn't leave her." Doc Miller studied him for a moment before nodding. "I'll send Mrs. Wilson over to help. She's a good nurse and her presence will keep the gossips at bay." Reid's home was a modest 2-bedroom house at the edge of town. It was sparsely furnished but clean, reflecting its bachelor owner. With Mrs. Wilson's help, they settled Nora in the spare bedroom, which had once belonged to Reid's younger brother before he'd moved to California. For 3 days, Nora drifted between consciousness and delirium as the fever raged. Reid took shifts with Mrs. Wilson, sponging Nora's forehead with cool water, changing her bandages, and coaxing broth and medicine between her lips. His deputy, young Tom Cassidy, handled the sheriff's duties, coming by regularly with updates. On the evening of the 3rd day, Reid was alone with Nora, Mrs. Wilson having gone home for the night. He sat beside the bed, reading aloud from a dog-eared copy of The Last of the Mohicans. He discovered that his voice seemed to calm her when the fever dreams were at their worst. "Sheriff," came a weak voice, interrupting his reading. Reid looked up to find Nora's eyes open and clear for the first time in days. The fever had broken. "You're awake," he said, setting the book aside. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," she replied with a ghost of a smile. "But alive, thanks to you." Reid poured a glass of water from the pitcher on the nightstand and helped her take a sip. "You're tough, Miss Parker." "Doc Miller says that's what saved you, that and a heap of stubbornness." Nora attempted to sit up, wincing at the pain in her arm. Reid quickly moved to support her, adjusting the pillows behind her back. "Where am I?" she asked, looking around the unfamiliar room. "My house." "Doc couldn't keep you at his office, what with the influenza patients coming in." He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how improper the situation might seem. "Mrs. Wilson from the church has been helping with your care." Nora nodded, seemingly unconcerned with proprieties at the moment. "You kept your promise," she said softly. "You didn't leave." Something warm spread through Reid's chest. "I'm a man of my word, Miss Parker. Please call me Nora. I think we're beyond formalities at this point." "Nora," he agreed, "and I'm Reid." A comfortable silence fell between them as Reid prepared a bowl of the chicken soup Mrs. Wilson had left. As Nora ate, he found himself studying her properly for the first time. Her dark brown hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her eyes were a striking shade of green. Despite the pallor of illness, he could see she was beautiful. "You should get some rest," he said when she'd finished eating. "Doc will be by in the morning to check on you." Nora caught his hand as he stood to leave. "Thank you, Reid, for everything." He gave her hand a gentle squeeze before releasing it. "Get some sleep, Nora." Over the next week, Nora's strength gradually returned. Mrs. Wilson continued to visit daily, bringing food and helping Nora bathe and change. The older woman's presence provided both practical assistance and a buffer against town gossip, though Reid made it clear he cared little for what people thought. During the days, while Reid attended to his duties as sheriff, Nora would rest or sit by the window, watching the comings and goings of Willow Creek. In the evenings, Reid would return, bringing news of the town and sometimes small gifts, a book from the general store, wildflowers from the prairie, or candy from the sweet shop. They would talk for hours, sharing stories of their lives. Reid told her about growing up in Wyoming territory with his father, a former Army scout, and his younger brother. He'd become sheriff 3 years ago after the previous lawman was killed in a bank robbery. Nora, in turn, shared her story. She'd been a schoolteacher in St. Louis, but after both her parents died of typhoid, she decided to accept a teaching position in Santa Fe. She had no siblings, no family left at all. "What will you do now?" Reid asked one evening as they sat on his small porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. "Will you continue to Santa Fe?" Nora was silent for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted. "The school term will have started by now. They've likely hired someone else." Reid hesitated before speaking again. "Willow Creek school teacher Miss Hammond is getting married next month. She'll be moving to Denver with her husband." He glanced at Nora. "The town council will be looking for a replacement." Hope flickered in Nora's eyes. "Do you think they would consider me?" "I'm on the council," Reid said with a smile. "I'd say your chances are excellent." The next day, Reid arranged a meeting with Mayor Thompson and the rest of the town council. Nora presented her credentials and answered their questions with intelligence and poise, impressing everyone present. "Well, Miss Parker," Mayor Thompson said when the interview concluded, "I believe you would be an excellent addition to our community. The position is yours if you want it." Nora accepted with gratitude, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She had a purpose again, a place to belong. There was, however, still the matter of her living arrangements. As her health improved, it became increasingly inappropriate for her to continue staying in the sheriff's home, despite Mrs. Wilson's chaperoning. "Mrs. Whitaker has a boarding house for respectable single ladies," Reid told her that evening. "I've spoken with her, and she has a room available." Nora felt a surprising pang of disappointment at the thought of leaving Reid's home. In the 2 weeks she'd been there, she'd grown accustomed to his presence, to their evening conversations, to the sound of his boots on the wooden floor. "That's very kind of you to arrange," she said, masking her feelings. "When should I move?" "Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it." Reid was looking out the window, his expression unreadable. "Doc Miller says your arm is healing nicely. You'll need to keep the bandage on for another week or so, but you can start using it for light tasks." "Reid," Nora said softly, "I don't know how I'll ever repay your kindness." He turned to face her, his blue eyes serious. "There's nothing to repay, Nora. I'm just glad you're going to be all right." The next morning, Reid helped Nora move her few belongings to Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house. The widow Whitaker was a plump, cheerful woman who welcomed Nora warmly and showed her to a comfortable room on the second floor. "Dinner's at 6 sharp," Mrs. Whitaker informed her. "We keep respectable hours here. No gentlemen callers after 8, and they're restricted to the parlor." She gave Reid a pointed look that made him shift uncomfortably. "I'll remember that, madam," he said, tipping his hat. Left alone in her new room, Nora felt strangely bereft. She sat on the narrow bed, running her fingers over the quilt, and wondered why leaving Reid's home felt so much like leaving home itself. The next few weeks brought significant changes to Nora's life. She began teaching at the small schoolhouse on the edge of town, quickly winning the affection of her students and the respect of their parents. She joined the Ladies' Aid Society and attended church on Sundays, gradually becoming integrated into the community. Reid continued his duties as sheriff, but he made time to see Nora regularly. He would walk her home from school or invite her to dinner at the hotel restaurant. Sometimes they would simply sit on the bench outside the general store, watching the town go about its business. Their friendship deepened, though both were careful to maintain propriety. Mrs. Whitaker kept a watchful eye on their interactions in the boarding house parlor, and Reid was always mindful of Nora's reputation. Then, 6 weeks after Nora's arrival in Willow Creek, everything changed. Reid burst into the schoolhouse just as Nora was dismissing her students for the day. His face was grim, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Reid, what's wrong?" Nora asked, her heart racing at the sight of him. He waited until the last child had left before speaking. "The Blackwell gang. They've been spotted about 10 miles from town." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. The nightmares had lessened over the weeks, but the memory of the attack still haunted her. "Are they coming here?" she whispered. "I don't know," Reid admitted, "but I'm not taking any chances. I've sent Tom to alert the ranchers, and I'm gathering men to form a posse." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "I want you to stay at the boarding house until this is over. Don't go out alone, especially after dark." Nora nodded, fear and concern warring within her. "Be careful, Reid." "Please?" Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. "I will," he promised. Then, surprising them both, he bent down and pressed a quick, gentle kiss to her forehead. "Lock your doors tonight." For 2 tense days, Willow Creek waited. Reid and his posse patrolled the area, searching for signs of the outlaws. The town itself was unusually quiet, with many families choosing to stay home and businesses closing early. On the evening of the second day, Nora was sitting in the boarding house parlor with the other female boarders, trying to concentrate on her mending but finding her thoughts constantly drifting to Reid. Was he safe? Had they found the Blackwell gang? A commotion outside drew everyone to the windows. Reid and his men were riding down the main street, a group of bound men in tow, the Blackwell gang, captured at last. Nora rushed out onto the porch, heedless of Mrs. Whittaker's call to remain inside. Reid saw her as he dismounted and handed his reins to a deputy. The look that passed between them spoke volumes. After the prisoners were secured in the jail, Reid came to the boarding house. He looked exhausted, with several days' worth of stubble darkening his jaw, but his eyes were clear and satisfied. "You got them," Nora said as they sat in the parlor, Mrs. Whittaker pointedly dusting nearby. "All 6 of them," Reid confirmed. "They were planning to hit the bank here, just like they did before." He ran a hand through his hair. "They'll stand trial in Cheyenne next month. They won't hurt anyone else." Relief washed over Nora. The men who had killed her fellow passengers, who had shot her and left her for dead, would face justice. She felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "What about you?" she asked quietly. "Will you testify at the trial?" Reid nodded. "I'll have to be in Cheyenne for at least a week, maybe longer." He hesitated, then added, "I'd like you to come with me if you're willing. Your testimony would help ensure they hang for what they did." The thought of facing the outlaws again made Nora's stomach clench with fear, but she straightened her shoulders. "I'll go," she said firmly. "I owe it to the others who didn't survive." Reid's eyes filled with admiration. "You're the bravest woman I've ever known, Nora Parker." Mrs. Whittaker chose that moment to cough loudly, reminding them of her presence. Reid cleared his throat and stood up. "I should go. I've got a lot to do before we transport the prisoners." He took Nora's hand briefly. "Thank you." After he left, Mrs. Whittaker gave Nora a knowing look. "That man cares for you, Miss Parker, and unless I'm much mistaken, you care for him too." Nora couldn't deny it. Somewhere amid her recovery, amid their conversations and shared experiences, she had fallen in love with Reid Jackson. But she had no idea if he felt the same, or if he merely saw her as someone he had rescued, someone he felt responsible for. The journey to Cheyenne took place 2 weeks later. Reid, Nora, Deputy Tom Cassidy, and 2 other lawmen escorted the prisoners on the train. For propriety's sake, Nora was given a separate compartment, but she spent most of the journey in the main passenger car with Reid, discussing the upcoming trial. In Cheyenne, Nora stayed at her respectable hotel for unmarried women, while Reid and the other men took rooms above a saloon near the courthouse. The trial began the day after their arrival, with Nora scheduled to testify on the second day. When her time came to take the stand, Nora was terrified but determined. The courtroom was packed, and the Blackwell gang sat at the defense table, their expressions ranging from boredom to outright hostility. Reid sat in the front row, his steady gaze giving her strength as she recounted the attack on the stagecoach. She described how the gang had gunned down the driver without warning, how they had murdered the elderly couple who offered no resistance, how she had been shot while trying to escape. "And would you identify the man who shot you, Miss Parker?" the prosecutor asked. Nora pointed to a man with a scar running down his cheek. "That one. He laughed after he shot me." A murmur ran through the courtroom and the judge called for order. The scarred man glared at Nora with naked hatred, causing her to falter momentarily. But then she caught Reid's eye, saw his slight nod of encouragement, and found her voice again. By the end of the week, the trial concluded with a guilty verdict for all 6 members of the Blackwell gang. They were sentenced to hang in 1 month's time. "You did it," Reid said as they sat in the hotel restaurant that evening, celebrating with a bottle of wine. "Your testimony was what convinced the jury, Nora," she shook her head. "We did it together. I couldn't have faced them without you there." Reid reached across the table and took her hand. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "I've been offered a position as federal marshal." Nora's heart sank. "You're leaving Willow Creek?" The offer came from Judge Harmon himself. "Said he was impressed with how I handled the Blackwell case." Reid squeezed her hand. "It would mean more money, more authority, but also more travel, more danger." "Is it what you want?" Nora asked, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. Reid was quiet for a moment. "A month ago, I would have said yes without hesitation, but now—" His blue eyes met hers. "Now there's you, Nora," her breath caught. "Me. I've been trying to find the right way to tell you this," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "I'm in love with you. Have been since I don't know when, maybe since that first night by the fire when you fought so hard to live." Joy bloomed in Nora's chest. "Reid, let me finish," he said gently. "I won't take the marshal job if it means losing you. But I won't ask you to give up the life you're building in Willow Creek either. So I guess what I'm saying is, I love you too," Nora interrupted, unable to contain the words any longer. "I have for weeks now." Reid's face lit up with such happiness that Nora felt tears spring to her eyes. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it. "Marry me," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Marry me, and whatever comes next, we'll face it together." "Yes," Nora whispered, her heart overflowing. "Yes, I'll marry you." They returned to Willow Creek as an engaged couple, much to the delight of Mrs. Whittaker, who claimed she'd known all along they were meant for each other. The town celebrated the news, especially when Reid announced he had declined the marshal position in favor of remaining their sheriff. "Are you sure?" Nora asked him privately. "It was such an opportunity." Reid pulled her close, mindful of Mrs. Whittaker watching from the porch. "I'm sure," he said. "My place is here with you. Besides," he added with a grin, "Willow Creek needs both its sheriff and its schoolteacher." They were married a month later in the town's small church, with Deputy Tom serving as best man and Mrs. Wilson as matron of honor. The entire town turned out for the celebration, which lasted well into the evening. That night, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, Reid looked at his wife with wonder. "Do you remember what I promised you that first night?" he asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. Nora smiled, leaning into his touch. "That you wouldn't leave my side." "I meant it then," he said, drawing her into his arms, "and I mean it now. Whatever comes, Nora Jackson, I'll be right beside you." "And I beside you," she whispered before his lips met hers in a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. Spring came to Willow Creek, bringing with it new growth and new beginnings. Reid and Nora settled into married life with a happiness that seemed to touch everyone around them. Their home, once sparse and bachelor-like, bloomed under Nora's care, with curtains on the windows and flowers on the table. They established routines: breakfast together each morning, a kiss goodbye as they went their separate ways to work, dinner in the evening where they shared the events of their day. On weekends, they would often ride out to the surrounding countryside for picnics or to visit neighboring ranches. "I never thought I could be this happy," Nora told Reid one evening as they sat on their porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. After my parents died, I felt so alone in the world. Reid pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. You're not alone anymore. You'll never be alone again. In July, Nora discovered she was expecting a child. She waited until she was certain before telling Reid, choosing a quiet Sunday afternoon when they were alone at home. I have something to tell you, she said, taking his hands in hers. Something wonderful. Reid's expression shifted from curiosity to awe as she shared the news. A baby, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. We're going to have a baby, Nora nodded, her own eyes filling with happy tears. In February, Dr. Miller thinks. Reid pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. You've made me the happiest man alive, Nora Jackson, he said against her hair. First by living, then by loving me, and now by carrying our child. The town received the news with enthusiasm, with the ladies immediately beginning to plan a quilting bee for the baby. Mrs. Wilson appointed herself Nora's unofficial guardian, constantly offering advice on pregnancy and childbirth that ranged from useful to outlandish. If you hang a knife under the bed, it will cut the pain of labor in half, she told Nora with complete seriousness. Nora thanked her politely but later laughed about it with Reid. I'm fairly certain that's not medically sound, she said as they prepared for bed. Reid's expression grew serious. I wish there was something I could do to make it easier for you. Nora touched his face gently. You do. Every day in 1,000 ways you make everything easier. As Nora's pregnancy progressed, Reid became increasingly protective. He insisted on walking her to and from the schoolhouse each day, despite it being only 3 blocks from their home. He took on more household chores, enlisted Tom to handle more of the sheriff's duties, and read every book on pregnancy and childbirth he could find. You don't need to worry so much, Nora told him one evening as he fussed over whether her feet were properly elevated. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I know, Reid admitted, sitting beside her. It's just when I found you that night, shot and alone on the prairie, I thought I might lose you before I even knew you. Now that I know you, now that I love you, the thought of anything happening to you or our child is unbearable. Nora took his hand and placed it on her rounded belly, where their baby was kicking vigorously. Feel that. That's our child telling you everything's going to be fine. Winter came early that year with the first snow falling in November. By December, Willow Creek was blanketed in white, the temperatures dropping well below freezing. Reid added extra insulation to their home and kept the fires burning day and night to ensure Nora and the baby stayed warm. Christmas was a joyous affair, with the Jacksons hosting a dinner for their closest friends Tom, Mrs. Wilson, Doc Miller, and Mayor Thompson and his wife. They exchanged gifts, sang carols, and celebrated the coming year, which would bring not only a new baby but also Willow Creek's incorporation as an official town rather than just a settlement. January brought a brutal cold snap that kept most of the town indoors. School was canceled for a week when temperatures became too dangerous for the children to walk there. Reid used the time to complete the baby's cradle, a project he'd been working on for months, carefully carving intricate designs into the wood. It's beautiful, Nora said when he finally showed her the finished piece. Our baby will love it. Just a few more weeks, Reid said, placing a hand on her belly. The baby was due in mid-February and both parents were counting the days, but babies, as Nora had learned from the many books Mrs. Wilson had pressed upon her, often had their own timetable. On the last day of January, during a rare break in the winter weather, Nora was at home preparing dinner when the first pain struck. It was different from the practice contractions she'd been experiencing, sharper, more intense. She gripped the edge of the table, breathing through it as Doc Miller had advised. When it passed, she continued with her tasks, knowing that first labors often took many hours. There was no need to alarm Reid just yet. He would be home from his rounds soon enough. But the next contraction came sooner than she expected and with greater force. Nora sank into a chair, suddenly uncertain. The baby wasn't due for 2 more weeks. Was something wrong? By the time Reid returned home an hour later, Nora was kneeling beside the sofa, gripping its edge as another contraction tore through her. "Nora!" Reid was at her side in an instant, his face pale with concern. "What's happening, the baby?" she gasped as the pain receded. "It's coming. Now." Reid helped her to their bedroom and then ran for Doc Miller, returning with both the doctor and Mrs. Wilson in tow. "Let's have a look," Doc Miller said calmly after washing his hands. After examining Nora, he nodded. "You're right, Mrs. Jackson. This baby is definitely coming today." "But it's too early," Reid protested, hovering anxiously at the foot of the bed. "Only by a couple of weeks," Doc Miller assured him. "The baby should be just fine. Now, Sheriff, I suggest you wait outside. Mrs. Wilson and I will take good care of your wife." Reid looked stricken. "I promised I wouldn't leave her side." Nora reached for his hand. "It's all right, Reid. This is how these things are done." "No," Reid said firmly. "I made a promise and I intend to keep it." He looked at Doc Miller challengingly. "I'm staying." The doctor exchanged glances with Mrs. Wilson, who shrugged. "It's unusual, but it's their decision," she said. And so Reid stayed, holding Nora's hand through each contraction, wiping her brow with a cool cloth, and whispering words of love and encouragement as her labor progressed. When she cried out in pain, he held her tighter. When she feared she couldn't continue, he reminded her of her strength. "You survived a bullet and a fever," he told her. "You can do this, Nora, and I'm right here with you." After 6 hours of labor, as the clock struck midnight and February began, their daughter was born, a healthy, robust baby girl with a shock of dark hair and her father's blue eyes. "She's perfect," Reid whispered, tears streaming down his face as Doc Miller placed the swaddled infant in Nora's arms. "You're both perfect." They named her Rebecca Hope Jackson, Rebecca after Reid's mother, and hope for what she represented to them both. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Reid sat beside the bed where Nora slept, cradling their daughter against his chest. The events of the past year played through his mind like scenes from a novel, finding Nora wounded beside his campfire, nursing her through the fever, falling in love with her courage and spirit, marrying her, and now becoming a father. "I will always keep my promises to you both," he whispered to his sleeping daughter. "I will always be by your side." Rebecca grew into a lively, curious child with her mother's intelligence and her father's sense of justice. By the time she was 5, she had a brother, James Thomas Jackson, who idolized his big sister and followed her everywhere. Willow Creek prospered and expanded, eventually getting a railroad spur that connected it to the main line. Reid remained sheriff, turning down 2 more offers to become a federal marshal. Nora continued teaching until James was born, then took a few years away before returning part-time to start a lending library for the town. On the 10th anniversary of the day Reid found Nora wounded on the prairie, they rode out to the spot where his campfire had burned that night. The children stayed with Mrs. Wilson, now a beloved honorary grandmother to them. "It seems like another lifetime," Nora said as they spread a blanket on the ground. The plains were covered in wildflowers with not a trace remaining of that desperate night. "So much has changed." "Not everything," Reid said, pulling her close. "I still love you more each day. I'm still keeping my promise to stay by your side." Nora looked up at the man who had saved her life, who had become her husband, the father of her children, and the center of her world. "And I'm keeping mine to stay by yours." As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, Reid and Nora Jackson held each other close, their hearts full with the life they had built together, a life that began with a fever, a campfire, and a promise that would last forever. The years continued to flow by, marking their life together with moments both ordinary and extraordinary. Willow Creek grew from a small cattle town to a respectable community with a proper school building, a town hall, and even a small theater where traveling shows would perform. Rebecca, their firstborn, inherited Nora's love of learning and at 18 left for a women's college in Denver, the first girl from Willow Creek to pursue higher education. James followed in his father's footsteps, becoming Reid's deputy when he turned 21. Their third child, Elizabeth Ann, born when Nora was 35, grew into a spirited young woman with artistic talents that amazed everyone who saw her drawings and paintings. Through it all, Reid and Nora's love remained constant, deepening with each passing year, each challenge faced together, each joy shared. When Reid turned 50, he decided it was time to pass the sheriff's badge to younger hands. James was the natural choice, having proven himself capable and level-headed in crises. The town council agreed unanimously, and in a simple ceremony at the town hall, Reid pinned the star-shaped badge on his son's chest. "Your father has kept this town safe for nearly 30 years," Mayor Phillips, the third mayor since Reid had become sheriff, told the assembled citizens. "We owe him and Mrs. Jackson a debt that can never be repaid." Retirement suited Reid well. He and Nora purchased a small ranch just outside town, where they raised horses and welcomed their growing number of grandchildren for extended visits. Reid taught the youngsters to ride and shoot, while Nora continued her work with the town library, which had grown to occupy an entire building of its own. "Do you ever regret it?" Nora asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over their land. She was 60 now, her dark hair streaked with silver, lines of laughter around her eyes, but to Reid, she was as beautiful as the day he'd first seen her. "Regret what?" he asked, taking her hand. His own hair had gone completely gray, and years of riding the range had left his face weathered, but his blue eyes were as sharp and kind as ever. "Staying in Willow Creek, turning down those marshal positions, you could have had a more exciting life." Reid chuckled, shaking his head. "Excitement." "Nora, I've had all the excitement any man could want. I caught outlaws, helped build a town, married the most extraordinary woman I've ever known, and raised 3 incredible children." He lifted her hand to his lips. "I've never regretted a single day." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James and his wife Sarah, bringing their 3 children for Sunday dinner. Soon the house was filled with laughter, stories, and the controlled chaos that came with family gatherings. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet once more, Reid and Nora lay in their bed, her head resting on his chest as it had nearly every night for decades. "I was thinking about that night," Reid said softly, stroking her hair. "The night I found you. What about it?" Nora asked, her voice sleepy. "I've always believed it was Providence that led me to you. I wasn't even supposed to be in that area. I'd been tracking the Blackwell gang in the opposite direction, but something, a feeling, an instinct made me change course." Nora raised her head to look at him. "You never told me that before," Reid smiled, touching her cheek gently. "I didn't want to sound like a superstitious old fool, but I've always thought that something larger than us brought us together that night." "Providence or chance," Nora said, settling back against him. "I'm grateful for it every day." When Reid was 75 and Nora 70, they celebrated their golden wedding anniversary. The entire town turned out for the occasion, holding a grand picnic in the town square. 3 generations of Jacksons gathered around them, their children, grandchildren, and even 2 great-grandchildren, the newest of whom was a baby girl named Nora in honor of her great-grandmother. 50 years, Reid marveled as they cut the anniversary cake Mrs. Wilson's daughter had baked. "It seems like both a lifetime and the blink of an eye." "The best 50 years any woman could ask for," Nora replied, her green eyes still bright with love for him. That night, after the celebrations were over, Reid took Nora's hand and led her to the small grove of trees behind their ranch house. There, in a clearing, he had set up a campfire with bedrolls laid out beside it. "Reid Jackson, what are you up to?" Nora asked, laughing. "We're a bit old for sleeping under the stars." "Not sleeping," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Just remembering." He helped her sit on one of the bedrolls and then carefully lowered himself beside her, his joints stiff with age. 50 years ago, I made you a promise beside a fire like this one." Nora's eyes grew misty. "You promised you wouldn't leave my side." And I never have, he said softly. Not in all these years. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. I had this made for you. Inside was a delicate gold locket. When Nora opened it, she found a tiny painting on one side, a campfire under a starry sky. On the other side were the words, "By your side always." "Oh, Reid," Nora whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "It's beautiful." He helped her fasten it around her neck, his fingers still strong and sure despite his age. "I want you to know," he said, "that finding you that night was the greatest blessing of my life. Everything good that's come since our children, our home, our life together, it all began with you fighting to live and me promising to stay." Nora leaned against him, her head fitting perfectly into the curve of his shoulder as it always had. "And we've kept our promises," she said. "Through everything, we've stayed side by side." The fire crackled before them, much like the one that had witnessed their first meeting. Above, the Wyoming sky stretched vast and star-filled, a canopy under which their love had grown from a whispered promise to a lifetime of devotion. Reid Jackson lived to see his 80th birthday, surrounded by his family in the home he had shared with Nora for over half a century. His health had begun to fail the previous winter, but he faced his declining strength with the same quiet courage he had shown throughout his life. On a warm summer evening, as the sun was setting, Reid asked to be helped outside to the porch swing he and Nora had sat on countless times over the years. Their youngest daughter, Elizabeth, was visiting with her husband and children, and she brought her father a blanket despite the mild temperature. "Will you sit with me, Nora?" Reid asked, his voice weaker than it had been but still warm with love. Nora took her place beside him, her hand finding his as it always did. Their children and grandchildren gave them privacy, sensing that this was a moment meant for just the two of them. "You remember what I told you the day Rebecca was born?" Reid asked, watching the colors of the sunset paint the sky. "You said we were perfect," Nora replied, squeezing his hand. "Me and the baby," Reid nodded. "I meant it. And do you know what? These 55 years with you have been perfect too. Not because we didn't have hardships or arguments or sorrows, but because we faced them together." He turned to look at her, his blue eyes filled with a lifetime of love. "You made my life perfect, Nora Jackson." Nora felt tears well up. "And you made mine perfect, Reid." They sat in silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, the first stars appearing in the darkening sky. Reid's breathing became more labored, but he refused to go inside. "I want to see the stars with you," he insisted, "just like that first night." As night fell completely, Reid's grip on Nora's hand began to loosen. "I love you, Nora," he whispered. "Always have, always will." "I love you too," she replied, her voice breaking. "More than words can say." Reid's eyes closed, a peaceful smile on his face. "Side by side," he murmured. "That's how we've always been. And how we'll always be," Nora promised, holding his hand against her heart as he took his final breath. Reid Jackson was laid to rest in the Willow Creek Cemetery 3 days later, with the entire town in attendance. The simple headstone bore his name, the dates of his birth and death, and the words, "Beloved husband, father, and protector." He kept his promises. In the days and weeks that followed, Nora was surrounded by the love and support of her family. Her children wanted her to move in with one of them, but she declined, preferring to stay in the home she and Reid had shared. "He's still here with me," she told them. "In every room, in every memory." Life continued as it must. Nora found purpose in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, in her work with the town library, and in recording the history of Willow Creek and the family she and Reid had created. On cold nights, she would sometimes build a small fire in the grove behind the house and sit beside it, feeling Reid's presence as strongly as if he were still physically with her. She would touch the locket she always wore and remember his promise, knowing that in all the ways that truly mattered, he had never left her side. 5 years after Reid's passing, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when they first met, Nora Parker Jackson died peacefully in her sleep, the locket clutched in her hand. She was buried next to Reid, her headstone matching his with the addition of the words she fought, she lived, she loved. The story of Reid and Nora Jackson became part of Willow Creek's folklore, how a wounded woman and a determined sheriff found each other on the vast Wyoming plains. How a promise made beside a campfire grew into a love that sustained them through 55 years of marriage, and how that love continued to inspire their descendants for generations to come. For in the end, it wasn't the bullet that defined Nora's life, nor the badge that defined Reid's. It was the promise they made to each other to remain side by side through whatever life brought their way. A promise kept, a love enduring, a legacy that would never be forgotten.